Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. So I am back with a reading of Clockwork Angel by Cassandra Clare, and today we are continuing with Chapter 1, The Dark House. Now, just to make the quick disclaimer, I don't own any of the text being presented here, nor am I trying to present any of the text as my own. This is all simply a read aloud I'm doing on this channel for entertainment purposes, and everything is in fair use. And of course, everything in the Shadowhunters Chronicles, as well as the Infernal Devices, is owned by Clare. And also keep in mind that I am recording this the day before it gets posted, so as you guys know, I pre-record all of these ahead of time, and I premiere them at different dates just so that it makes it easier for me to upload everything onto the channel. So, this is The Clockwork Angel by Cassandra Clare, Chapter 1, The Dark House. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade. William Ernest Henley. Invictus. The sisters would like to see you in their chambers, Miss Grey. Tessa set the book she had been reading down on the bedside table, and turned to see Miranda standing in the doorway of her small room, just as she did at this time every day, delivering the same message she delivered every day. In a moment, Tessa would ask her to wait in the corridor, and Miranda would leave the room. 10 minutes later, she'd return and say the same thing again. If Tessa didn't come obediently after a few of these attempts, Miranda would seize her and drag her, kicking and screaming, down the stairs to the hot, stinking room where the Dark Sisters waited. It had happened every day of the first week that Tessa had been in the Dark House. As she had come to call the place, they kept her prisoner, until eventually Tessa had realized that the screaming and kicking didn't do much good and simply wasted her energy that was probably better saved for other things. "One moment, Miranda," Tessa said. The maid bobbed an awkward curtsy and went out of the room, shutting the door behind her. Tessa rose to her feet, glancing around the small room that had been her prison cell for 6 weeks. It was small, with flowered wallpaper, and sparsely furnished. A plain deal table with a white lace cloth over it, where she ate her meals. The narrow brass bed where she slept. The cracked washstand and porcelain jug for her ablutions. The windowsill where she stacked her books. And the small chair where she sat each night and wrote letters to her brother. Letters she knew she could never send. Letters she kept hidden under her mattress, where the Dark Sisters would not find them. It was her way of keeping a diary, and of assuring herself, somehow, that she would see Nate again someday, and be able to give them to him. She crossed the room to the mirror that hung against the far wall, and smoothed down her hair. The Dark Sisters, as they in fact seemed to wish to be called, preferred her not to look messy, although they didn't appear to mind her appearance one way or the other past that, which was fortunate, because her reflection made her wince. There was the pale oval of her face dominated by hollow gray eyes, a shadowed face without color in its cheeks or hope in its expression. She wore the unflattering black schoolmarmish dress that those sisters had given her once she'd arrived. Her trunk had never followed her, despite their promises, and this was now the only piece of clothing she owned. She looked away quickly. She hadn't always flinched from her reflection. Nate, with his fair good looks, was the one in the family generally agreed to have inherited her mother's beauty, but Tessa had always been perfectly content with her own smooth brown hair and steady gray eyes. Jane Eyre had brown hair, and plenty of other heroines besides. And it wasn't so bad being tall, either. Taller than most of the boys her own age. It was true, but Aunt Harriet had always said that as long as a tall woman carried herself well, she would forever look regal. She didn't look regal now, though. She looked pinched pinched and bedraggled, and altogether like a frightened scarecrow. She wondered if Nate would even recognize her if he saw her today. At that thought, her heart seemed to shrink inside her chest. Nate! He was the one she was doing all this for, but sometimes she missed him so much. It felt like she'd swallowed broken glass. Without him, she was completely alone in the world. There was no one at all for her. No one in the world who cared whether she lived or died. Sometimes the horror of that thought threatened to overwhelm her and plunge her down into a bottomless darkness from which there would be no return. If no one in the entire world cared about you, did you really exist at all? The click of the lock cut her thoughts abruptly. The door opened. Miranda stood on the threshold. "It is time to come with me now," she said. "Mrs. Block and Mrs. Dark are waiting." Tessa looked at her in distaste. She couldn't guess how old Miranda was. 19? 25? There was something ageless about her smooth round face. Her hair was the color of ditch water, pulled back harshly behind her ears, exactly like the Dark Sisters' coachman. She had eyes that protruded like a frog's, and made her look like she was permanently surprised. Tessa thought they must be related. As they went downstairs together, Miranda marching along with her graceless, clipped gait, Tessa raised her hand to touch the chain around her throat, where the clockwork angel hung. It was a habit. Something she did each time she was forced to see the Dark Sisters. Somehow the feel of the pendant around her neck reassured her. She kept hold of it as they passed landing after landing. There were several levels of corridors to the dark house, though Tessa had seen nothing of it but the Dark Sisters' chambers, the halls and stairs, and her own room. Finally, they reached the shadowed cellar. It was dank down here, the walls clammy with unpleasant moisture, though apparently the sisters didn't mind. Their office was ahead, through a set of wide double doors. A narrow corridor led away in the other direction, vanishing into darkness. Tessa had no idea what lay down that hallway, but something about the thickness of the shadows made her glad she had never found out. The doors to the sisters' office were open. Miranda didn't hesitate, but clumped inside, Tessa following after her with great reluctance. She hated this room more than any other place on earth. To begin with, it was always hot and wet inside, like a swamp, even when the skies outside were gray and rainy. The walls seemed to seep moisture, and the upholstery on the seats and sofas was always blooming with mold. It smelled strange as well, like the banks of the Hudson on a hot day, water and garbage and silt. The sisters were already there, as they always were, seated behind their enormous raised desk. They were their usual colorful selves, Mrs. Black in a dress of vibrant salmon pink, and Mrs. Dark in a gown of peacock blue. Above the brilliantly colored satins, their faces were like deflated gray balloons. They both wore gloves despite how hot the room was. "Leave us now, Miranda," said Mrs. Black, who was spinning the heavy brass globe they kept on the desk with one plump white-gloved finger. Tessa had many times tried to get a better look at the globe. Something about the way the continents were laid out had never looked quite right to her, especially the space in the center of Europe, but the sisters always kept her away from it. "And shut the door behind you." Expressionless, Miranda did as asked. Tessa tried not to wince as the door shut behind her, closing off what little breeze there was in this airless place. Mrs. Dark tilted her head to the side. "Come here, Teresa." Of the two women, she was the more kind, more likely to wheedle and persuade than her sister, who liked to convince with slaps and hissed threats. "And take this." She held something out, a dilapidated bit of pink fabric tied in a bow, the sort that might be used as a girl's hair ribbon. She was used to being handed things by the Dark Sisters now, things that had once belonged to people, tie pins and watches, mourning jewelry, and children's toys. Once the laces of a boot. Once a single earring, stained with blood. "Take this," said Mrs. Dark again, a hint of impatience in her voice, "and change." Tessa took the bow. It lay in her hand, as light as a moth's wing, and the Dark Sisters stared impassively at her. She remembered books she had read, novels in which characters were on trial, standing quaking in the dock at the Old Bailey and praying for a verdict of not guilty. She often felt she was on trial herself in this room, without knowing of what crime she stood accused. She turned the bow over in her hand, remembering the first time the Dark Sisters had handed an object to her, a woman's glove, with pearl buttons at the wrist. They had shouted at her to change, had slapped her and shaken her as she'd told them over and over again with rising hysteria that she had no idea what they were talking about. No idea what they were asking her to do. She hadn't cried, even though she'd wanted to. Tessa hated to cry, especially in front of people she didn't trust. And of the only two people in the world she trusted, one was dead and the other imprisoned. They had told her that, the Dark Sisters, had told her that they had Nate, and if she didn't do what they said, he would die. They showed her his ring, the one that had been her father's, stained with blood now to prove it. They hadn't let her hold it or touch it, but had snatched it back as she'd reached for it. But she'd recognized it. It was Nate's. After that, she had done everything they'd asked, had drunk the potions they'd given her, done the hours of agonizing exercises, forced herself to think the way they wanted her to. They'd told her to imagine herself as clay, being shaped and molded on the potter's wheel, her form amorphous and changeable. They'd told her to reach down into the objects they'd given her, to imagine them as living things, and to draw out the spirit that animated them. It had taken weeks, and the first time she had changed, it had been so blindingly painful that she'd vomited and passed out. When she'd woken, she'd been lying on one of the moldering chases in the Dark Sisters' rooms, a damp towel being sponged across her face. Mrs. Black had been leaning down over her, her breath as bitter as vinegar, her eyes alight. "You did well today, Teresa," she said. "Very well." That evening, when Tessa had gone up to her room, there had been gifts for her. 2 new books on her bedside table. Somehow the Dark Sisters had realized that reading and novels were Tessa's passion. There was a copy of Great Expectations and, of all things, Little Women. Tessa had hugged the books to herself and, alone and unwatched in her room, had let herself cry. It had grown easier since then, the changing. Tessa still didn't understand what happened inside her to make it possible, but she had memorized the series of steps the Dark Sisters had taught her, the way a blind person might memorize the number of paces it takes to walk from their bed to the door of their room. She didn't know what was around her in the strange dark place they asked her to journey to, but she knew the pathway through it. She drew on those memories now, tightening her grip on the ragged bit of pink fabric she held. She opened her mind and let the darkness come down, let the connection that bound her to the hair ribbon and the spirit inside it, the ghostly echo of the person who had once owned it, unravel like a golden thread leading through the shadows. The room she was in, the oppressive heat, the noisy breathing of the Dark Sisters, all of it fell away as she followed the thread, as the light grew more intense around her and she wrapped herself in it as if she were wrapping herself in a blanket. Her skin began to tingle and to sting with thousands of tiny shocks. This had been the worst part once, the part that had convinced her she was dying. Now she was used to it and bore it stoically. She shuddered all over, from her scalp to her toes. The clockwork angel around her throat seemed to tick faster, as if in rhythm with her speeding heart. The pressure inside her skin built. Tessa gasped, and her eyes, which had been closed, flew open as the sensation built to a crescendo, and then vanished. It was over. Tessa blinked dizzily. The first moment after a change was always like blinking water out of your eyes after submerging yourself in a bath. She looked down at herself. Her new body was slight, almost frail, and the fabric of her dress hung loose, pooling on the floor at her feet. Her hands, Clasped in front of her were pale and thin, with chapped tips and bitten nails, unfamiliar alien hands. "What is your name?" Mrs. Black demanded. She had risen to her feet and was looking down at Tessa, with her pale eyes burning. She looked almost hungry. Tessa didn't have to answer. The girl whose skin she wore answered for her, speaking through her, the way spirits were said to speak through their mediums. But Tessa hated to think about it that way. The change was so much more intimate, so much more frightening than that. "Emma," said the voice that came from Tessa, said, "Miss Emma Bayliss, ma'am." "And who are you, Emma Bayliss?" The voice replied, words tumbling out of Tessa's mouth, bringing strong images with them. Born in Cheapside, Emma had been one of 6 children. Her father was dead, and her mother sold peppermint water from a cart in the East End. Emma had learned to sew to bring in money when she was still a small child. Nights she spent sitting at the little table in her kitchen, sewing seams by the light of a tallow candle. Sometimes, when the candle burned down and there was no money for another, she would go out into the streets and sit below one of the municipal gas lamps, using its light to sew by. Is that what you were doing out on the street the night you died, Emma Bayliss?" asked Mrs. Dark. She was smiling thinly now, running her tongue over her lower lip, as if she could sense what the answer would be. Tessa saw narrow, shadowy streets, wrapped in thick fog, a silver needle working by faint yellow gaslight, a step muffled in the fog, hands that reached out of the shadows and took hold of her shoulders, hands that dragged her, screaming, into the darkness, the needle and thread falling from her hands, the bows ripped from her hair as she struggled, a harsh voice shouting something angry, and then the silver blade of a knife flashing down through the dark, slicing into her skin, drawing out the blood. Pain that was like fire, and terror like nothing else she'd ever known. She kicked out at the man holding her, succeeding in knocking the dagger from his hand. She caught the blade and ran, stumbling as she weakened, the blood draining out of her so fast. She crumpled in an alley, hearing the hissing scream of something behind her. She knew it was following her, and she was hoping to die before it reached her. The change shattered like glass. With a cry, Tessa fell to her knees, the torn little bow falling from her hand. It was her hand again. Emma had gone, like a cast-off skin. Tessa was once more alone inside her own mind. Mrs. Black's voice came from far away. "Teresa, where's Emma?" "She's dead," Tessa whispered. "She died in an alley, bled to death." "Good," Mrs. Dark exhaled, a sound of satisfaction. "Well done, Teresa. That was very good." Tessa said nothing. The front of her dress was splotched with blood, but there was no pain. She knew it was not her blood. It wasn't the first time that this had happened. She closed her eyes, spinning in the darkness, willing herself not to faint. We should have had to have her. Sorry, can't say that. "We should have had her do this before," said Mrs. Black. "The matter of the Bayliss girl has been bothering me." Mrs. Dark's reply was curt. "I wasn't sure she was up to it. You remember what happened with the Adams woman?" Tessa knew immediately what they were talking about. Weeks ago, she had changed into a woman who had died of a gunshot wound to the heart. Blood had poured down her dress, and she had changed back immediately, screaming in hysterical terror until the sisters had made her see that she herself was unharmed. "She's advanced wonderfully since then, don't you think, sister?" Mrs. Black said. "Given what we had to work with in the beginning, she didn't even know what she was." "Indeed, she was absolutely unformed clay," Mrs. Dark agreed. "We have truly worked a miracle here. I can't see how the Magister could fail to be pleased. Mrs. Black gave a little gasp. "Does that mean, do you think it's time?" "Oh, absolutely, my dear sister. She's as ready as she'll ever be. It's time for our Teresa to meet her master." There was a gloating note in Mrs. Dark's voice, a sound so unpleasant that it cut through Teresa's blinding dizziness. What were they talking about? Who was the Magister? She watched through lowered eyelashes as Mrs. Dark jerked the silk bell pull that would summon Miranda to come and take Tessa back to her room. It appeared that the lesson was over for today. Perhaps tomorrow, Mrs. Black said, or even tonight. If we told the Magister she was ready, I cannot imagine he would not hurry here without delay. Mrs. Dark, stepping out from behind the desk, chuckled. I understand that you're eager to be paid for all our work, dear sister, but Teresa must not be simply ready. She must be presentable as well as able. Don't you agree? Mrs. Black, following her sister, muttered a response that was cut short as the door opened and Miranda came in. She wore the same dull look as ever. The sight of Tessa crouched and bloody on the floor seemed to occasion no surprise in her. Then again, Tessa thought she had probably seen far worse in this room. Take the girl back up to her room, Miranda. The eagerness was gone from Mrs. Black's voice, and she was all brusqueness again. Get the things, the ones we showed you, and get her dressed and ready. The things you showed me? Miranda sounded blank. Mrs. Dark and Mrs. Black exchanged a disgusted look and approached Miranda, blocking Tessa's view of the girl. Tessa heard them whispering to her and caught a few words. Dresses and wardrobe room, and do you think you can make her look pretty? And then finally, Tessa heard the rather cruel, I'm not sure Miranda is clever enough to obey vague instructions of that sort, sister. Make her look pretty. But what did they care whether she looked pretty or not, when they could force her to look any way they wanted? What did it matter what her true appearance was? And why would the Magister care? Though it was very clear from the sisters' behavior that they believed he would. Mrs. Black swept from the room, her sisters following behind her, as she always did. At the door, Mrs. Dark paused and looked back at Tessa. Do you remember, Teresa, she said, that this day, this very night, is what all of our preparation has been for? She took hold of her skirts in both bony hands. Do not fail us. She let the door bang shut behind her. Tessa flinched at the noise, but Miranda, as always, seemed utterly unaffected. In all the time she had passed in the dark house, Tessa had never been able to startle the other girl, or surprise an unguarded expression out of her. Come, Miranda said. We must go upstairs now. Tessa rose to her feet slowly. Her mind was whirling. Her life in the dark house had been horrible, but she realized now, grown almost used to it. She had known what to expect each day. She had known the Dark Sisters were preparing her for something, but she had not known what that something was. She had believed, naively perhaps, that they wouldn't fail her. Why waste all this training on her if she was only going to die? But something in Mrs. Dark's gloating tone gave her pause. Something had changed. They had achieved what they wanted with her. They were going to be paid. But who was going to do the paying? Come, Miranda said again. We must get you ready for the Magister. Miranda, Tessa said. She spoke softly, the way she might have spoken to a nervous cat. Miranda had never answered a question of Tessa's before, but that didn't mean it wasn't worth trying. Who is the Magister? There was a long silence. Miranda stared straight ahead, her doughy face impassive. Then, to Tessa's surprise, she spoke. The Magister is a very great man, she said. It will be an honor for you when you are married to him. Married? Tessa echoed. The shock was so intense that she could suddenly see the whole room more clearly. Miranda, the blood-splattered rug on the floor, the heavy brass globe on the desk, still tilted in the position Mrs. Black had left it in. Me? But who is he? He is a very great man, Miranda said again. It will be an honor. She moved toward Tessa. You must come with me now. No! Tessa backed away from the other girl, retreating until the small of her back struck painfully against the desk. She looked around desperately. She could run, but she'd never get past Miranda to the door. There were no windows, no doors to the other rooms. If she hid behind the desk, Miranda would simply drag her out and haul her to her room. Miranda, please! You must come with me now, Miranda repeated. She had almost reached Tessa. Tessa could see herself reflected in the black pupils of the other girl's eyes. could smell the faint, bitter, almost charred smell that clung to Miranda's clothes and skin. "You must!" With a strength she didn't know she possessed, Tessa seized the base of the brass globe on the desk, lifted it, and swung it with all her might at Miranda's head. It connected with a sickening sound. Miranda reeled back and then straightened. Tessa shrieked and dropped the globe, staring. The whole left side of Miranda's face was crushed in, like a paper mask that had been smashed flat on one side. Her cheekbone was flattened, her lip mashed against her teeth, but there was no blood. No blood at all. "You must come with me now," Miranda said in the same flat tone she always used. Tessa gaped. "You must come, Miranda's voice shuddered and broke, degenerating into a stream of gibberish. She moved toward Tessa, then jerked to the side, twitching and stumbling. Tessa turned from the desk and began to back away as the injured girl spun, faster and faster. She reeled across the room like a staggering drunk, still shrieking, and crashed into the far wall, which seemed to stun her. She collapsed to the ground and lay still. Tessa raced to the door and out into the corridor beyond, pausing only once, just outside the room, to look back. It seemed in that brief moment as if a thread of black smoke were rising from Miranda's prone body. But there was no time to stare. Tessa darted down the hall, leaving the door hanging open behind her. She dashed for the stairs and hurtled up them, nearly tripping over her skirts and banging her knee painfully on one of the steps. She cried out and scrambled on, up to the first landing, where she dashed into the corridor. It stretched out ahead of her, long and curving, disappearing into shadows. As she raced down it, she saw that it was lined with doors. She paused and tried one, but it was locked, and so was the next one, and the next one after that. Another set of stairs led down at the end of the hallway. Tessa raced down them and found herself in an entryway. It looked as if it had once been grand. The floor was cracked and stained marble, and high windows on either side were shielded with curtains. Excuse me. A little bit of light spilled through the lace, illuminating an enormous front door. Tessa's heart leaped. She dived for the knob, seized it, and flung the door open. There was a narrow cobblestone street beyond, with rows of terraced houses lining either side. The smell of the city hit Tessa like a blow. It had been so long since she had breathed outside air. It was close to dark. The sky the dimming blue of twilight, obscured by smudges of fog. In the distance, she could hear voices, the cries of children playing, save for a man leaning against a nearby gas lamp, reading a newspaper by its light. Tessa dashed down the steps and toward the stranger, catching him by the sleeve. "Please, sir, if you could help me!" He turned and looked down at her. Tessa stifled a scream. His face was as white and waxy as it had been the first time she'd seen him, at the dock in Southampton. His bulging eyes still reminded her of Miranda's, and his teeth gleamed like metal when he grinned. It was the Dark Sisters' coachman. Tessa turned to run, but it was already too late. Okay, so, as I was saying, that was Chapter 1, that was the first chapter. And obviously with Tessa, this is the beginning of her journey. She was held prisoner for, 6 long weeks by these mysterious Dark Sisters, whom so far we really don't know anything about, but we do know that they are the owners of the Pandemonium Club. Now, the Pandemonium Club, we've seen it in the Mortal Instruments book. That was where the first book started. That was where all of it started, the Pandemonium Club. That was the very beginning of the first Mortal Instruments book, where Clare ends up meeting Jace, Alec, and Izzy for the first time and sees a demon for the first time. But the entire thing here is that we see the Pandemonium Club has existed even back in the Victorian era, that it was commonplace for clubs like that to exist. But the Dark Sisters owning it, this is a detail that I'm very, very vague on, because I've only read brief mentions of it on the Mortal Instruments and Shadowhunters Wikipedia pages, so I really, can't give a very definite description of who the Dark Sisters are, because honestly, I'm just as new at this as some of you probably are. You know what I mean? It's like I'm reading this for the very first time and I'm going to be surprised by a lot of things that are going to go down in this book for sure. I think that every single little detail is going to surprise me, and I think that even the familiar stuff that I know from the original, you know, Shadowhunters books, like I think that every little tiny detail is just going to surprise me because I'm reading this with fresh eyes. Like, this is something that's whole new for me. This is a whole new world. This is brand new. And I'm really, really excited about it. But obviously, Miranda is something of Clockwork, because they say that no blood was gushing down her face, that her face looks like smashed or something, and that she was speaking gibberish and sounded like a broken computer almost, or a broken machine. And it's obvious that the Dark Sisters were creating these clockwork type creatures that, you know, do their bidding for them. But obviously that's like the whole premise of it. I mean, this story is called The Clockwork Angel for a reason. Like, it makes me wonder, was the Clockwork Angel created by the Dark Sisters or something else? You know, I really can't give a definite answer because I don't know the full history of everything that happened with the infernal devices. But Tessa is, you know, she's arranged to be married to the Magister, whom we have no idea who the hell that is. Like, I personally have no idea who the frig the Magister is, but if she is arranged to get married to this guy and the Dark Sisters work for him, then I can imagine that he is not a guy that I personally would want to ever be married to. I can tell you that much. That's for sure. But chapter 2 is called Hell is Cold. So, yeah. Lots of things are going to go down. Oh, yeah. And I just personally can't wait for the moment when Jem and Will end up finding her. Oh, this is going to get good. Oh, yes, it is. So, there you have it. That was my reading of the very first chapter of The Clockwork Angel. I hope you guys enjoyed this reading, and you can comment down below and give me your thoughts and opinions on chapter 1 and let me know how you like it so far, because, you know, this is my first time reading this, and so far I'm really, really enjoying it. So, God bless, happy viewing, and have a nice day, guys. See ya!